Hello, everybody. Welcome to this SCAF webinar. My name is Ben Jackson. I'm from the University of Edinburgh, and I'll be chairing this webinar. And today, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Nick Jonsson, who is giving the webinar for us today. But before that, just for those of you that might not know about SCAF, I'll just give a very brief overview of what SCAF, the Scottish Alliance for Food, is all about, and how you might get involved beyond just being here to see the webinar. So just in case you didn't catch names, I'm Ben Jackson, and the webinar is from Nick Jonsson, and we're here as part of the Scottish Alliance for Food, and the primary objective of the Scottish Alliance for Food is to bring together stakeholders across the whole of the Scottish food system, whatever their interests may be and whatever the roles that they may play, in order to come together and collectively and collaboratively network all of those people, but also then try to tease out collectively what are the important things necessary for the transformation of the food system in Scotland towards better sustainability for the future in general. And the SCAF project has some core working groups and thematic avenues that we've been working on that include mapping, innovation, culture, as well as security. And we are progressively engaging more and more people. So it's wonderful to have you here for this webinar. And we have various means with which you can interact with the project. You can join us, you can become a member of the Scottish Alliance for Food and engage across a range of activities. So please do. And if you want any more information about that, I'd be happy, and others on this online currently would be happy to help you connect with us. But now to hand over to our guest today, Professor Nick Jonsson, who is going to be speaking about connecting science and policy. Nick Jonsson was invited by Reg Jones, who unfortunately can't be here, but if I understand correctly, Reg did his PhD with you, Nick, or has
Yeah,
PhD
he's just submitted. So yeah, he's just yeah. So we're just arguing about how many examiners he needs at the moment.
Very good, very good. Anyway, but to introduce you a bit more formally, so Professor Nick Jonsson graduated as a veterinary surgeon from the University of Sydney in 1987, has worked as a mixed farm and small animal practitioner until 1994. He then did a PhD in Queensland on the effects of heat stress and genetic merit on ovarian function in dairy cattle. Subsequently, he's worked as a research scientist in Queensland at the government's Australian Tropical Dairy Institute, then moved into an academic career at the University of Glasgow before going back again to Queensland in Australia and moving back again to Glasgow in the early 2000s. And subsequently, Nick has been working on sustainable livestock health and production at the University of Glasgow in several roles. In 2019, he started working with the Food Standards Agency and is now the chair of the advisory committee on animal feeding stuffs. But just before everybody came online, Nick was updating us that he in fact has now, or is in the process of transitioning from some of those roles, but I'll let him clarify those for you and hand over. Thank you very much for being here, Nick.
Good. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Laura. And thanks, Reg, even though you're not here and you've run off and gone and played with cows instead. All right. So this is one of those rare opportunities where I get to speak about stuff without really necessarily having a curriculum to speak to, which is quite good fun. Right, so I will try and speak fairly quickly because I've got lots and lots of slides as usual, and I would welcome any interruptions at any point in time. So the changes that Ben was referring to are I recently resigned from the University of Glasgow, like last pretty much the month before last, and I've gone to work for this company called Harbro, which is a livestock nutrition company, and I've been working with them, I guess on an irregular consultancy basis, and had a number of projects with them over the last 12 years, 15 years. And so now I've gone to work with them part-time. I'm continuing to work with the Food Standards Agency, and I will be taking on a role as editor-in-chief of Journal of Dairy Research fairly shortly. So I've got a few hats on at the moment, which in some respects, it's not that different from having a general academic career. So I'm going to go through a little bit of my background and who I am, so that you've got an idea, because I think people are interested in how you get into this policy area. So this was me as a kid, and this was where I emerged in a northern suburb of Sydney in Australia. As you can see, it's hardly a rural environment. It's not the sort of place that you'd expect farm animal vets to emerge from. But that's, I think, one of the mistakes we often make is having assumptions about what kinds of people end up in what kinds of jobs and what suits them particularly well. So very briefly, because a lot of what I refer to in this talk is in relation to animal production and consumption of animals or consumption of secondary products, I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from. So politically, socially, I'm pretty much a centrist in every respect, which is a bit of a difficult position to hold these days, but that's where I am. From a meat-eating perspective, I guess I would be regarded as a facultative vegetarian, having gone for periods of 18 years without eating meat, and not eating a huge amount of meat. What do I think about eating meat? Well, I have no. I'm actually, from a moral perspective, I'm a moral non-realist and probably an error theorist, which means that I probably don't have the kind of value system that would enable me to make a judgment on the rightness or wrongness of eating meat. But being a moral non-realist doesn't preclude you from having ethics and ethical principles which you abide by. And I think a lot of my work is trying to maintain an ethical approach to animal utilisation. So I'm happy to have a talk about that at any stage. My first job after I graduated was in a farm animal practice in this place called Gerringong, which is the coast. Apologies for the rubbish photographs. People who are my age started their lives without digital images, and we had to wait a long time to get these photographs back. And so, and in fact, a lot of the photographs have gone missing. But that's me tormenting my old boss while he was doing some surgery, and this was the place where we were in practice. So I had a mixed practice there, and then I struck out with one of my mates from uni, Stuart, sitting down here with the dog. That's me standing up with the cat, and we bought a veterinary practice in northern New South Wales. And at the time, I had a small farm, a small block of land, was building a house on it, and you can see we had cows helping us build the house. I also had this genius idea that I was going to build up a very large dairy farm. As you can see in the top left, that's a picture of one of my cows. And the idea was to, because we only had space enough for about 30 cows, we were going to lease the cows out to our local farmers, and we would be able to have more cows. And of course, that was when I learned some important lessons about people and their sense of responsibility to each other. And despite the fact that I put out all these, not all these cows, I had about 6 cows, and I'd put them on various dairy farms around the place. And I'd say, look, if the cow looks sideways, if she doesn't even look slightly well, if there's anything at all wrong with it, just call me out. I'm going to come out. I won't charge you a thing. There will be no fees. It's my cow. I will do everything I can. So needless to say, 50% of my herd died the first year I had them leased out, just because the farmers really didn't look after them. So it was a big lesson, but irrelevant to what we're talking about now, except in the sense that I developed a policy of my own not to do that again. Right. So why policy? Why get involved in it? And I think, in many respects, over time in the academic career. And I have to say, when you said that about me going backwards and forwards between Glasgow and Queensland, I did feel a bit stupid. It does seem like a bit of a stupid thing to do. But I guess it's worked. Anyway, so we spend a lot of time trying to, in animal science, looking at marginal gains. The idea that we can improve our performance by 1 to 2 to 3%, and then we will get a disproportionate increase in profitability because we're already got all our fixed costs covered and everything like that. But these marginal gains can just really disappear very quickly, and I'll give a couple of examples of that. Early in my practice career, I was in mixed practice, and I had a number of pig farmers come to me and say, "Nick, can you do some pig consulting work for us? Because no one will do pigs. There are no vets who are going to look at pigs. No one's interested in them." And I thought, "Yep, fine, that's great, really interesting." And this is not one of our herds. This is a US type of pig herd, and you can see it's quite a crowded environment, not very pleasant. But I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I went into it. I did a lot of reading. I found out a lot about pig production, pig husbandry, and I went to work. We had a really good system. We had an abattoir in our town, so we could follow the pigs through the abattoir, and we'd pick up things like, on the left, that's Lawsonia, which is an intracellular bacterial pathogen, causes a chronic ileitis. And on the right is Glass's disease, which is an infection with a Haemophilus, and it causes a pleuritis and systemic infection. And we could actually go through the system, quantify the number of animals with these conditions. Then we could make recommendations with respect to how to control them. And I found that the farmers really responsive to everything that I would say, and they were great to work with. And I thought, yeah, this is good. We're getting some improved production. However, fairly shortly after that, or at the same time, the Australian government had decided that we were going to reduce the quarantine requirements and the meat import requirements, and we would be able to bring Canadian pork into the country. And so what happened was that my farmers all went broke pretty well overnight. And so that was a big lesson to me that policy trumps science and professional practice pretty quickly. And if you look at this in the United Kingdom context, so this is after I came to the UK this second last time. If you look at, these are price per kilogram on the y-axis and year on the x-axis, and this is for pork meat. Okay, and you can see the price was in 2014, it was about 170 pence per kilogram, and in 2016 it had dropped down to about 110. Right, that's a huge drop, and that was because we had welfare regulations in the UK that were introduced prior to them being introduced in the EU, which meant that our British pig producers were at a substantial disadvantage relative to the EU. And despite the fact that the UK consumer consistently says they're very happy to spend extra for high welfare product, when it comes down to it, if the Danish or Dutch product is 10 pence per kilogram cheaper, they're probably going to buy the Danish or Dutch product, and the UK product goes out. So again, during this period, 2014, 2016, huge number of pig producers went out of business. Now, 2016, some of you may remember, is a year when there was a pretty stupid election, and referendum, and I have no idea what precipitated this increase in prices, because it certainly predates the actual change with respect to the movement of animals. So there has been a steady increase since then, and in 2022, of course, we have problems with pig diseases elsewhere, and so there's a general worldwide increase in the price. So these are, look at the fluctuation in there. You go from about 110 pence per kilogram to 220. That's 100% change in the price per kilogram of the product. Now, as a scientist, is there anything I can do that's going to get anywhere near that 100% payback? I really, I don't think so.
Not without legislation
Exactly.
as a
Yeah.
sideways constraint. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the things, exactly right, Ben, because everything that is going to give that kind of level of uplift in performance is already controlled by regulation somewhere or another, because it's not just a matter of feeding something that we already know about. And of course, in the last few days, we've all had the excitement of the trade almost war, maybe a war. Is it a war? That's going on at the moment. And of course, that's resulted already in some price shifts. So lean hog futures ease on Trump tariff worries. I mean, deciphering headlines can be a bit tricky, but basically what's happened is that the future prices of pigs in the US and Canada are expected to decline over the next little while. Well, they were yesterday. Today they're probably back where they were. So my first academic job after getting out of that private practice thing was to do a PhD, and it was on partly on heat stress in dairy cattle. And we did a number of studies on heat stress, trying to work out how to manage it, improve the well-being of the cattle, and at the same time improve the profitability of farmers. And as a good scientist, I was looking at things like survival curves and trying to work out the effect of blood glucose concentrations on the time of ovulation after calving, because with dairy cows, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but a cow has to calve to start producing milk, right? And so she calves, produces milk, and then she must stop milking, and she must have become pregnant prior to that, stop milking, and then calve again. And one of the major determinants of the profitability of dairy farms is how quickly after calving they become pregnant again. Okay, so if a cow goes for a long period of time before becoming pregnant again, then there is a very long period where the cow is not producing milk, but she's still consuming food. Is this a bad thing for the environment? Probably. Also has a major impact on greenhouse gas emissions intensities as well, because the more animals on a farm that aren't producing milk, the higher your greenhouse gas emissions intensity is. All right. So that was the type of work that we were doing. Over time, we drifted into looking at how this, what kind of effect this had economically. And I'm not trying to annotate. I was trying to, that's all right, I don't know. You can't see my pointer waving around there, can you?
We can.
Oh, you can. Oh, okay, good. All right. I'll just stick with that. So we started to look at some of the economic consequences of the increasing temperature humidity intake, index on milk yield, food intake, and all the rest of it. And ultimately, what we ended up with from that was some reasonable recommendations that were able to go out into practice. And I think this is some of the early work that I did. And because I was working at this Tropical Dairy Research Centre, we did a lot of public engagement, what would now be called public engagement, but we regard, well, it's not quite public engagement, it's extension. The distinction between public engagement being that we were talking to audiences that had a particular interest in dairy cattle production. And so we're trying to help farmers to manage heat stress in their cattle, reduce it. And then ultimately the recommendations that we made end up being codified into codes of practice to improve animal welfare. And so I kind of feel that was, having worked in that background within the Tropical Dairy Research Centre, where we were definitely working with farmers, our objective was to try and improve the nature of dairy production over time. We got some traction. So I think the main benefits from that work were not not my relationships between glucose concentration and ovulation rate, but really the recommendations that we can make that were to some extent based on that. So this is a picture of you probably worked it out already. These are ticks. I spent some time working on a tick control project, and the picture on the left is actually the scrotum of a young bull in Uganda, and you can see it's got these huge amblyomma ticks on it, and they've got very large mouth parts. The ticks on the right, these are Rhipicephalus microplus, which were the ones that mostly I was researching. So I did a lot of research on ticks and tick control. And again, it was predominantly driven by biological aspects of controlling ticks. But realistically, in the real world, ticks are mostly driven by legislation. So this is Texas on the top right. These are the different, this is the Rio Grande, the river between Mexico on the left bottom and Texas on the top. Now, Mexico has got an infestation with ticks. The USA does not. It is officially tick-free, cattle tick-free. This is Rhipicephalus microplus, particular species of tick that transmits a fatal hemoparasite. And this exists as a tick-free area because the Americans undertook an eradication program back at the turn of the century before last. Right? Oh, no, so about 1900 through to 1960, they were eradicating ticks. Took an awful long time. A few people were killed as a result of it because farmers didn't all want to, treat their cattle for ticks. But ultimately, they got rid of the ticks, and they just have this little spot down in the southeast where they have reinfestations. So what's controlling ticks here? Is it science? Not really. It's policy, and it's tick riders. They have armed guys riding around on horseback, roping cattle if they see any, impounding them and sending them back over the border when they do that. In Australia, we had a very similar situation. The picture on the left is from about 1900, newspaper in 1900, and it shows that in the north parts of Queensland, there were tick infestations, and they were prevented from progressing any further by prevention, restrictions on cattle movement. And the picture on the right is the current situation in Queensland, where we have cattle tick-free areas and cattle tick-protected areas. If I want to move cattle from the red area to the green area, I have to go through one of these black points, which is a dipping center. Cattle have to be inspected, dipped, and then may be allowed to move on if they are free. So again, we have done some useful scientific research. We've developed diagnostic tests for acaricide resistance. We've identified a number of the mechanisms that lead to resistance to the ticks, and they've been useful, but they haven't been implemented to any great extent. They haven't been commercialized to any great extent. The main thing that's continued to keep the ticks where they are is the government policy. And one of the things that and this is in addressing the original point of how to get involved in policy. This is where I started really. I was working at the University of Queensland, and I had a colleague, Ian One, pictured on the bottom left here. He was an agricultural economist, and Malcolm McLeod is the fellow on the bottom right. He worked for the Queensland Department of Primary Industries, and they had a need to do a review project on what they call the third-party dipping system. So if you look at all these dots along here, each one of these used to be operated by the Queensland government, and then in about 2003 or 4, I think, they turned them over to private operators like this fellow here, and they said, here are the protocols. This is how you control ticks at the border. I mean, at this line. You can charge the farmers as they bring the livestock across. And so it was a user pay system, which was subsidized by the government. And we did a review of this project. And I really can't emphasize strongly enough how useful doing this kind of work has been to me. Consultancy work for government to review or get involved in reviews. And I think to me, this is really the beginning point for a lot of things. So we did this review. We spent a lot of time walking, getting around the whole of Queensland, checking these places out. We came up with the review document, which we presented duly to the minister, and of course it was. They said, "Yeah, lovely work," and ignored pretty much everything of it. So one thing you have to recognise when you get into policy work is that policy is not always, doesn't always follow the rational directions that you think it should after a careful analysis, and that farmers will make not farmers, but politicians, policymakers will make decisions according to other criteria. Finally, almost
Nick,
finally,
I'll just
yeah,
let you know that we're coming up for the half hour, so you're probably halfway
okay,
through now. Yeah,
okay,
a little bit
fantastic,
more
thanks.
maybe.
Yeah. So also similarly, Botswana, place where we had a lot of projects with students. These are Cape Buffalo in up near Maun in the Okavango Delta. And Cape Buffalo are very deadly animals if you're a person, if you go near them, particularly when they've got a calf on them. So we didn't go near these guys. But the main, in Botswana, we're mainly concerned about these guys because they are vectors of, reservoirs, sorry, of foot and mouth disease. And if you look at a map of Botswana, you can see that the green areas, there's nothing green much in Botswana apart from the Okavango Delta in the wet season. But they've got these green forests. It doesn't really look like that. But the point is that all of these red areas and blue areas is where they have the buffalo, and they're completely full of foot and mouth disease. Down at the bottom here, a place called Labatsi, they have an abattoir. They've got a single abattoir for the whole country. Botswanans love cattle. They have 2 million cattle or something like that. There are 2 million people and 2 million cattle. And if you're a politician, you don't be a politician without having cattle because they're important status. You know, they're important part of your, you know, your political currency. And they were trying to build the beef industry, and they were exporting from Labatsi to the EU. Okay, and it was kind of going all right, but then they ran into problems with their veterinary services and the traceability of livestock because of the issue of foot and mouth disease up in the north, and because of the issues in relation to individual animal traceability. All of that policy related. There's no point in doing a science-based project on livestock in Botswana unless the underlying challenges of the export policy, the development policy, and the policy is put in place to develop the infrastructure to enable the development of it. So I'm going to talk now about the actual advisory committee on animal feeding stuffs. And I'll start with the most recent stuff, which you've probably all seen, Bovaer. I'm sure people have got some ideas about Bovaer, but most people had never heard of Bovaer before November last year. And then people suddenly became experts in Bovaer. And we had lots of tweets like these. Coles is a retailer in Australia. It's a bit like Tesco. So boycott it. And then they've highlighted these things from the label of Bovaer. And you can see that these are obviously chemicals. So chemicals, by definition, are bad, even including water and oxygen, I presume. But you know, they're obviously problematic. And safety and effectiveness have not been evaluated in animals, which I will get to this in a moment. And then not for human use, right? So there are quite a lot of food materials that you actually don't want to necessarily be eating. And there's a whole lot of points that are missed about this, but I'll come back to it. And if you look up here, we've got Jasper Truth's point, carcinogenic Bovaer milk. Okay. Bill Gates, what's Bill Gates got to do with it? Bill Gates is down here again as well. And we're talking about the non-existent problem, misspelt, of cow burps. So what? Bill Gates has nothing to do with this product. In fact, Bill Gates does have some investment in a rival product, but not this one, right? So this is all just complete misinformation that's out there. So I'll come back to that in a moment. What I wanted to start with was a little bit of talk about the regulation, how it works. I'll skip through this fairly quickly, right? So we have some 3 tiers of documentation and regulation that we deal with. And as chair of the advisory committee on animal feeding staffs, we run the risk assessment side of the process. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. I'm standing down as chair of the advisory committee because I'm moving to work in a more commercially related position. And so conflicts of interest might become a bit of a problem. But the umbrella legislation addresses human health, animal health, and the environment and the risk assessment that's required. And in particular, we deal with feed additives, right? So that includes things like Bovaer. It's any, we have a lot of microorganisms, particularly probiotics, that might be used, and we have microbial treatments for animal feeds which improve the digestibility. We have a lot of enzymes, whereas feed materials are separately defined and don't really usually come under our jurisdiction. So there's specific legislation relating to the feed additives, and in order to be put in the feed, it has to do something, right? You can't just put a feed additive in the feed for no reason, right? That can't be done. So it has to have some beneficial effect, right? That's a fundamental aspect, and that might be to kill coccidia or histomonas, or it might be to improve the environmental consequences of animal production, which is the story with Bovaer. So the overarching legislation is very general, doesn't provide a lot of detail. And then we have the regulations, which are secondary regulations, which provide the detailed information on it. And then what we have is what we call guidance documents, and these are provided at the moment by the EU equivalent of the FSA, right? So the European Food Safety Authority, not Food Standards Agency. So we're the we're the UK Food Standards Agency, which is also FSA, and they're the European Food Safety Authority. They have a documentation, and of course, my group has only taken over since Brexit, and we have a risk assessment which is informed by these guidance documents. And the guidance documents go into great detail about the criteria that have to be met by an applicant for a product that's looking for authorization. All right, so in this case, this is just how to put together an application, and this is how they have to characterize the the product. And then in the UK, we have an online application portal, and there's a process which you can see here, which you probably completely of zero interest, but it takes up a lot of my time working through. Mostly the committee that I work on is at this assessment stage, the scientific committee. So we work there, other groups work elsewhere. Right, so we have different types of additives. Some of them are technological, some of them are sensory additives. So these are flavoring agents, okay, or things that improve the intake of feed. And what we find happens is that a lot of products are registered as or authorized as sensory additives, but there will be some additional reason why the manufacturers will encourage producers to use them. They can only claim, however, on any of the labeling or official documentation, marketing or anything like that, that they're flavoring agents or sensory additives. So we end up sometimes with a few particular problems. Nutritional additives are things like vitamins and minerals, for which we know that they have a beneficial effect in the correct dose. And then most of our time is spent with zootechnical additives, which are things that have a direct effect on either the performance of animals in good health or are used to favorably affect the environment.
About 10 more minutes, Nick.
Okay, thanks. All right. So, so the regulatory basis, that I've already talked about that. The overarching legislation is very general, and then we get to much more specific regulation detail with the lower level material. So there are our terms of reference. What our membership currently is about 15 people, right? So, and the reason for, one of the reasons why I think it's good to get out to speak to people about this is that the FSA is always recruiting for members for their scientific advisory councils. There are 7 or 8 scientific advisory councils, right? And I think it's 8 now. And ours, the Advisory Committee on Animal Feeding Stuffs, has 15 or 16 members, depending on when it is. I think we're at 16 at the moment. We've got myself, I'm the only vet that's on at the moment. We have 4 toxicologists. We've got 5 people who are kind of experts in the feed industry or animal nutrition. And we got 5 people who are good on either microbiology. Microbial genetics is a really big area for us because we have to characterize all of the microbial agents that are used, and we have to ascertain that there's zero risk of, or not zero, but minimal risk of antimicrobial resistance elements. So that's kind of our breakdown, and we've got a real mix of a kind of academic and industry-based people. And one of the challenges I think that we're finding increasingly now is that it is difficult to find academics who are happy to work in this space, because the work is very different. It's not, like you have to, it's detailed work. You have to be very careful. It's very conservative. And it sometimes can be a bit, to be honest, sometimes reading through these dossiers can be a little bit boring, and it can take a lot to focus and go through the work and stay concentrated. But overall, it's a very rewarding process, and I've learned a huge amount while I've been on the panel that on the committee. At the moment, one of the problems that we face, and all of the science advisory committees face, is conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest. And this is why I think it really is important for people in academia to embrace this kind of work, get involved in, understand it. And it's because most of the people on our committee who do have a good understanding of the real world application of the products that we're doing risk assessments for, do work for a company. They do it for a living. There's not a huge amount of active research in some of these areas that we're dealing with, right? So from a researcher's perspective, how useful is this for me? Well, if I was doing policy research, which I think I'd quite like to do now, but I hadn't worked out until I got to this stage in my career, it would be useful, right? But as a veterinary scientist, it gives me a few things that might be interesting to chase up. But is BBSRC likely to fund any of them? Probably not, right? If I really want to make my career one which is driven by, large program grants, then this is probably going to cut into the time that I have for that rather than augment it. However, it would make me better at, understanding the, the implications of work that I was going to do. So I think this is an area that is well worth investing in, even if there is not, and there is probably not, a direct benefit in terms of obtaining the large kind of, grant funding that most people in academia are really chasing. Right, so with the authorization process, we're looking at identity and characterization, safety and efficacy. And, with identity, we're looking at composition, how it's quantified, the impurities, the homogeneity, the manufacturing process, how stable the product is, and we have to see how it's intended to be used. For safety, we've got 4 different areas. I'll address them each. The first one is the target species. So with bovine, it has to be safe for cattle. Okay. We have to be able to establish a no observed adverse effect level. We have to work out what the threshold is at which we get problems, and we have to do genotoxicity and reproductive studies. For the consumers, we have to know how much of it goes into the food chain potentially, and we have to work out where it's, what the hazards are from that. We have to know what the expected daily intake is going to be for the product at the end. We have to understand how much of it remains in the tissues. Then we have toxicological studies and determination of a maximum residue limit at the end. For the users and workers, and this refers back to the bovine story, we have to look at whether there are hazards to the manufacturers, hazards to farmers who might be mixing it, consumers like owners of pets. Not all of our products are for farm animals. We have products that are used in pet foods or given to pets. And so we have to be confident that we don't have any of these, or that not so much we don't have any of these risks, but that they're all properly identified, characterized, and subsequently managed. Increasingly an issue, we have to establish their safety for the environment. We have 2 phases for that. In many cases, we don't have to do very much for this because we know that the product is completely metabolized, doesn't go into the environment. But that's not the case in all instances. So we do have to assess that as well. And then the one that provides a little bit more of a challenge in some respects is efficacy. We have to demonstrate that the product is efficacious. And this is an area where I personally have some views that we should be able to improve the system such that it's a more to streamline it a little bit, because it is quite difficult. And at the moment, a lot of these products do have relatively small effect levels. You know what I was talking about before, 1, 2, 3% effects. Now, when you're designing animal studies where you have sufficient power to detect effects of 2 or 3 or 5%, they involve a lot of animals, and then we've got a lot of ethical considerations. And so there are arguments that people have made, and which I tend to subscribe to a little bit, that with most products, the farmer can make a decision themselves whether they want to use the product or the user. And if I buy something, I start using it, I find it doesn't work, well, I stop using it. Like that happens with a lot of people with supplements for arthritis or all sorts of supplements. You think, okay, there's some potential benefit, I'll take it for a while. If it doesn't work, I stop taking it. Right now, that becomes a bit messy with things like Bovie. I'm just about finished, Ben. I'm pretty much through the slides here, so I think it's
Perfect.
about
That's
4
great.
or 5 minutes here. So I talked already about these things, but sorry, with these efficacy assessments, that is a problematic area because people have to prove using studies that the product is efficacious, and that's quite a rigorous process, right? So ACAF, I don't need to go through that sort of stuff. What we find is that a lot of the applications, the dossiers are not very well put together. There's a lot of sloppiness in them. And this whole process, as you can imagine, is very conservative, very detail driven. There's a lot of boxes to be ticked. And even though some of the things don't necessarily seem very logical to me or to other people, they are written into the legislation and therefore they have to be done. We just unfortunately are not able to take shortcuts in particular areas. One of our biggest issues is with respect to efficacy studies not being done to the correct level. We have challenges within the committee of interpretation of the legislation, interpretation of the guidance documents. We're trying to maintain registers to do that. Ultimately, we would like to revise some of the regulations, but the resources aren't necessarily there. So once we've gone through the process of doing the risk assessment, there's a consultation process. It's a formal public consultation, and they tend to be bulk done. So we had 24 feed additives, including the Bovaer one. Okay, 24 additives, and we basically, and they went out to 30,000 people, and we got 6 responses. Okay, so you can see that public level of engagement is not very high, and a lot of people on Twitter and all around the place will say it's not a transparent process. Well, it is. It's transparent, but you have to look in order to be able to see it. No one's going to, say, "Hey, did you hear about this authorization application?" And if you look at the stakeholders' comments on one of the products that went through, which is not Bovaer, 2 respondents shared their opinion that feed additives were unnecessary and that natural products should be used rather than for seeking profit. So, we don't get a huge amount. And others expressed the view that there may be long-term effects on children. And of course, that is so much exactly what we are trying to rule out by going through this whole safety process. So I think one of our huge problems is this public disengagement from the process, this lack of realization of the work that goes on at in the background. So at the end of this is 3-nitroxypropanol or 3-nop, which is Bovaer, right? So we issue a risk assessment, which is published, and the decision's written into legislation, and it subsequently becomes law. And really, most of our applications for new authorizations are about a year, greater than a year. the level of work involved in one of the assessments is really substantial. The level of detail required is very substantial. It's a pretty robust process, I think. If a product goes through that risk assessment process now and is considered to be safe, then I would generally consider that there's, very little reason to believe that there may be problems with it. That doesn't mean it's a perfect system, and we are continuing to try to work on it. So that's it. That's my slide. So